Welcome to Crisis in Perception, a show about how ideas, systems, and incentives shape the way we see the world. In this episode, we're exploring Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber.
And this is a really fascinating deep dive because it gets at one of the most unsettling observations about the modern economy. It's this paradox of pointlessness.
Yeah, the core idea, which comes from years of research, is that for all our amazing technological advances, we've somehow built an entire system that just generates work that the workers themselves think is, well, completely unnecessary.
It is a massive paradox because it just flies in the face of everything that was predicted, a couple of generations ago.
Absolutely. If you go back and read someone like John Maynard Keynes, his famous prediction from the mid-20th century, the assumption was totally clear. He thought that these huge productivity gains from technology would basically solve the economic problem.
He was very specific about it. He suggested that by around 2030, technology would have just accelerated production so much that the big problem for society would be what to do with all our free time.
A 15-hour work week, maybe 20, tops. That was the vision.
Yeah, humanity would finally be free from, the grind. Free to dedicate time to projects, pleasures, visions, and ideas. This whole world of administrative drudgery was supposed to just wither away.
But, I mean, just look around. That is not the world we live in. The reality isn't some utopia of leisure. It's a landscape of ballooning corporate law offices and academic administrators who are just constantly swamped.
Not to mention the labyrinth of healthcare compliance and this huge growing industry of human resources and PR professionals.
Exactly. The productivity did soar. That part came true.
Right.
But instead of more free time, we just got more jobs. Entirely new kinds of jobs whose main output seems to be making more paperwork for other administrators to handle.
And Graeber's point is that this isn't just some random accident. It's a fundamental structural pathology. We're not just talking about a few inefficient jobs here and there.
No, we're talking about an entire economy, especially in places like North America and Europe, where the jobs that are obviously essential, nursing, teaching, logistics, are just relentlessly squeezed.
While at the same time, these huge armies of white-collar workers are being hired for roles that make no discernible contribution to society. And the worst part is, the workers themselves know it.
And you're talking about a significant number here. There was a YouGov poll that found an incredible 37% of British workers believed their jobs made no meaningful contribution to the world.
37%. I mean, that's not just a few people having a bad day at the office. That suggests a massive structural failure. Graeber called it a scar across our collective soul.
So for you, listening to this, maybe sitting in an office or getting ready for a big compliance meeting, this deep dive is a way to understand why that feeling of futility might be so widespread.
Absolutely. And our mission here isn't to do individual career counseling or to, judge people's life choices. That would be completely missing the point.
Right. We're looking at the system, the organizational incentives, the hidden ideologies that create and protect these pointless jobs, often in a way that seems to go completely against the logic of capitalism and market efficiency.
That's the core question, isn't it? Why would a system that's supposedly obsessed with profit spend billions of dollars paying people to effectively do nothing?
Okay, so if we're going to dig into this, we first need a really solid definition. The book gives a very precise and I think deliberately subjective definition of what a bullshit job actually is.
That's right. A bullshit job is one that the worker themselves secretly considers to be pointless, unnecessary, or maybe even harmful to society.
And this is the crucial part, right? Graeber's big assumption is that the worker, in making that judgment, is usually correct.
Exactly. And that focus on subjectivity is so clever because it immediately cuts off the most common objection.
Which is, well, who are you to judge the social value of a job? Maybe that high-paid lawyer is actually doing something important for the market.
Right. But the book just sidesteps that whole external, potentially elitist argument. It focuses purely on the individual's own internal belief that their work is meaningless.
And when you think about how deep that conviction can run, it's powerful.
There's this anecdote he tells about a corporate tax litigator in New York. This guy was, a brilliant poet in his youth, but he had student debt, a family to provide for, so he went into corporate law. He was making a huge salary at a top firm.
Classic story.
And the second he finally achieved financial security, he had this crushing realization that his job contributed literally nothing. His entire role was to find loopholes so that extremely wealthy clients could avoid paying taxes.
So if his job and all his colleagues' jobs just vanished overnight,
Society would arguably be better off. And that's the thing. The external reality was high status, huge paycheck. The internal reality was just a moral void. The gap between those two is where a bullshit job lives.
It's the difference between what the system pays you to believe about yourself and what you, deep down, actually know is true about your impact on the world.
And to really get this, we have to make a crucial distinction. We have to separate bullshit jobs from what he calls shit jobs.
Okay, because people often mix these two up, but they're really moral opposites, aren't they?
Complete opposites. A shit job, as the book defines it, is work that's genuinely unpleasant. It might be difficult, dangerous, really low paid.
So think of a hospital cleaner, or the people who collect our garbage, or someone in a call center getting yelled at all day.
Exactly. The key thing is, these jobs have undeniable, obvious, and immediate social value.
If the garbage collectors vanish, society grinds to a halt in a matter of days.
If the hospital cleaners disappear, the hospital becomes a biohazard. The world literally cannot function without them. And that social value, even when the pay is terrible and the work is awful, it provides a kind of dignity.
Right. Workers in those jobs often take a real pride in the fact that, without me, this whole place would fall apart.
And this stark contrast starts to set up what he later calls the inverse value rule. We start to see a society that tends to pay essential labor really poorly.
While at the same time, it showers huge salaries on high-status, self-admittedly meaningless white-collar work. It's a complete moral and economic inversion.
It explains so much of the resentment you see directed at, say, unionized workers like teachers or nurses when they fight for better wages. There's this hidden assumption that because their work is valuable, they shouldn't also expect to be well paid.
And the greatest irony of all is where this stuff happens most. You'd think it would be in bloated public sectors, but it's really the private sector.
Right. The old cliche about the Soviet Union creating make-work jobs, 3 clerks to sell 1 piece of meat. That was inefficient, sure, but it was at least consistent with their ideology that everyone must have a job.
But capitalism, it's supposed to be ruled by the ruthless logic of profit. It should, in theory, be aggressively cutting any unnecessary costs. So why would a CEO pay someone to be a flunky or a box ticker for 20 years?
That's where the absurdity really hits home. Graeber contrasts that old public sector cliche. He tells the story of this Spanish civil servant, a guy named Garcia.
Oh, I remember this one. He was only caught after he missed work for 6 years to study Spinoza, right? And they only found out when he was due for a long service award.
Exactly. That's a failure of oversight. Inefficient public bureaucracy. But now, compare that to the private sector version, Kurt, a subcontractor working for the German military.
Oh.
His job, which was outsourced down a long chain of private companies, required him to fill out this incredibly complex, custom paperwork just to justify moving a piece of equipment like 5 meters down the hall.
So it's a private company creating bureaucracy for a public one.
And the whole process was so layered with private contracts and compliance checks that it cost hundreds of euros of taxpayer money and wasted huge amounts of time. The irony is, if Garcia's job was cut, nothing really changes. But if Kurt's job was eliminated, the German military would probably be forced to streamline its logistics and find a much more efficient way to move things around.
So the private sector's obsession with outsourcing and complex contracts has actually created more madness?
More destructive forms of madness, you could argue, than the old public sector ever did. It turns efficiency itself into this expensive managed commodity rather than something you just do.
Okay, so to help us make sense of this whole invisible world of administration, Graeber distilled hundreds of these worker testimonies into 5 basic categories of bullshit jobs. It's a really compelling way to see the different reasons why these jobs get created.
And it's important to remember that most real-life jobs are probably a mix of these. But seeing the pure types really helps you understand the underlying function. So let's start with the first one, flunkies.
Flunkies. This one feels almost feudal.
It is. It's conceptually linked to historical feudal retainers. The purpose of a flunky is almost purely symbolic. They exist to make their superior look important, powerful, or busy.
So the job's very uselessness is what makes it valuable. It's a kind of human status symbol. A lord had retainers who didn't really do anything. They just needed to be seen around him.
And in the modern office, this takes on more subtle forms. Take Jurte, the receptionist at a Dutch publishing company. The phone might ring, once a day? Maybe.
So what did she do all day?
Her actual tasks were to keep a candy dish full of mints and to wind a grandfather clock once a week. That was it.
So why pay a full-time salary for that?
Because not having a receptionist would signal that you're not a serious company. It would look bad to clients. She wasn't an employee. She was basically furniture that signaled success.
The story of Jack the cold caller is even more nuts. He worked in securities trading.
Yeah, he was literally paid a cash stipend, often out of his broker's own pocket, not to actually sell stocks, but just to sit nearby and make his broker look successful enough to need an assistant.
So he was just a prop.
He was a totem. He'd call people, offer free research material, and make sure to say he was calling on behalf of the broker. In that hyper-competitive, macho environment, the broker was just buying a status signal. He was buying the appearance of being too important for mere phone calls.
So flunkies confirm the importance of the person they serve. Their uselessness is their value.
Precisely. Okay, moving on to the second category, duct tapers.
Duct tapers. I think I know where this is going.
These are the people whose jobs only exist because there's a glitch, a fault, or just sheer incompetence somewhere in the organization that management refuses to fix.
They're just patching up a leaky system, cleaning up messes that shouldn't even exist.
And the most frustrating thing about these jobs is that the real fix is usually cheap and obvious. But for political reasons or budget reasons or just pure vanity, managers won't do it.
It's like hiring someone full-time to empty a bucket under a leaky roof instead of just fixing the roof.
It's exactly that. The system gets obsessed with optimizing the response to failure instead of just fixing the cause. There's this story of Magda, a tester at a company. Her job was to proofread research reports written by this posh star researcher statistician.
Okay.
This guy apparently avoided using verbs, he didn't understand statistics, and his reports were often just grammatically incorrect nonsense.
Oh, no.
So Magda's entire job was to try and convince him to fix his own reports, which he never would because he was too senior. And then she had to take the mess to the directors who didn't understand statistics anyway. She was literally being paid to compensate for one senior person's incompetence and vanity.
That sounds soul-crushing. Which I guess leads perfectly into the third category, box tickers.
Yes! Box tickers. These are the employees who exist mainly so an organization can claim it's doing something that it is demonstrably not doing. This is the absolute heart of audit culture.
This is where reality stops being what's actually happening and becomes what's on the paperwork.
Exactly. As soon as you introduce formal metrics for success or compliance in a bureaucracy, the incentive immediately shifts to gaming the metric, not achieving the actual outcome. The box ticker is the person who creates the paper trail to prove everything is fine, regardless of what's happening on the ground.
The book talks about how common this is in universities. There's a story about a grad student at Yale who was getting great grades, but she had a personal tragedy and fell behind on her paperwork.
And she was expelled. Not for failing her classes, but because, as the administration told her, if you don't get the forms in on time, you didn't take the course. The paper reality completely overrode the human reality.
Wow.
And then there's Mark, a senior quality and performance officer in a UK council. He summed it up perfectly. His job was, and I'm quoting here, ticking boxes, pretending things are great to senior managers, and generally feeding the beast with meaningless numbers that give the illusion of control.
So he's creating reports that nobody acts on.
He wrote this glossy, complex housing service report that he admitted made absolutely no difference to the residents. But his managers loved it because it looked good. The appearance of the report became the goal, not the housing services themselves.
Okay, next up we have taskmasters. This is the managerial class, right?
Exactly. But they're not just facilitating work. They're either monitoring it unnecessarily or, worse, they're actively generating new, pointless work for other people to do.
They come in two flavors, as I remember.
Right. Type 1 is the useless superior. The book gives the example of Ben, a middle manager who figured out that 75% of his time was spent just monitoring the work of his 10 employees.
Who were perfectly capable of doing it without
They're perfectly capable. His only job was to hand them work and make sure they hit some arbitrary numbers. And if he ever tried to do any actual productive work himself, his own bosses would tell him to get back to monitoring.
And then you've got the type 2 taskmaster, the bullshit generator.
These are the ones who actively create new bullshit tasks for other people, usually just to justify their own job. Like Chloe, a non-executive dean at a university, she spent 2 years just making up strategies and action plans that she knew would be completely ignored.
Why?
Just to give her subordinates something to look busy with. This is the core of managerialist ideology. It's about spinning plates. Endless meetings about synergy, new performance targets, strategies, all completely disconnected from the actual teaching and research the university is supposed to be doing.
So the taskmaster's job isn't to create value. It's to create the appearance of necessary activity,
Mhm.
which then forces everyone else to start box ticking and duct taping.
It's a vicious cycle. Which brings us to our final and maybe most destructive category, goons.
Goons, this one sounds aggressive.
They are. These are employees whose jobs are aggressively manipulative, deceptive, or even hostile towards other people, but their existence is required by the system. They basically exist to introduce friction and hostility into the market.
So you're talking about corporate lawyers whose job is to sue small businesses out of existence,
Mm-hmm.
or PR people who spin disasters.
Exactly. Or take Tom, the beauty worker. It's a fascinating case. His job was image enhancement for commercials, using visual effects to get rid of bags under women's eyes, airbrush skin, make pop stars look thinner.
So photo retouching.
But it's more than that. He was paid to subtly manipulate the visual reality of celebrities, not just for some fun illusion, but to change the viewer's unconscious ideas about what a normal body is supposed to look like.
So it makes you feel inadequate.
Precisely. It makes the viewer feel inadequate in their own reality, which then exaggerates how effective the commercial solutions, like makeup or diet products, seem to be. It's a kind of coercive manipulation that fuels consumption.
And you see the same thing with aggressive telemarketing.
Yes, workers admitting they were forced to pressure people into signing up for things that weren't in their best interest. Selling credit scores you can get for free, or running bait-and-switch subscription scams. The job isn't just pointless, it's actively, aggressively negative.
There's a tricky one in here, though. The flat catcher.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Like Tim, the college receptionist who is basically paid just to absorb the anger of students and parents. It's definitely a shit job. It's miserable and psychologically damaging.
But is it a bullshit job?
It's ambiguous. Graeber suggests that flat catchers actually do provide a real service to the organization. They shield management from public anger. The question is whether the need for that shield is legitimate or if it's just covering up for systemic failure, like a ridiculous billing policy.
So if it's just managerial incompetence creating the anger, then the flat catcher is a kind of duct taper goon hybrid.
Exactly.
Okay, so that taxonomy of pointlessness.
Yeah.
It leads us right to the human cost. This isn't just about economic waste, is it? We're talking about a genuine, profound, psychological, and you could say spiritual violence being inflicted on millions of people who are forced to pretend their work matters.
The psychological damage is often way more profound than the stress you get from genuinely difficult work. Graeber draws a parallel to historical ideas about punishment.
He brings up Dostoevsky
Right.
from his time in the gulags.
Yeah. Dostoevsky observed that the most extreme punishment isn't just hard labor, it's forced, completely useless labor, like being made to carry dirt from one side of a yard to the other and then back again over and over.
The ritual of futility.
That's it. That kind of mandated, acknowledged pointlessness, it leads to despair and humiliation far more quickly than doing meaningful, even if harsh, work like making bricks. The human spirit just needs to feel like it's having an effect.
And this taps into something really fundamental about who we are.
It does. The German psychologist Karl Gruss called it the pleasure at being the cause. It's the simple joy an infant gets when it figures out it can make things happen in the world, like banging a rattle to make noise. That's the foundation of our sense of self.
So being systematically denied that, being told your skills and effort produce nothing real, is what another psychiatrist, Francis Bruchek, called the trauma of failed influence.
It's an assault on your identity. If your job forces you to pretend to be a functional, useful adult, while you know deep down that you're not, it creates this crushing cognitive dissonance.
And you see this in the indignity of enforced make work, the boss just exercising power for its own sake. I think almost everyone has had a job like that at some point.
Oh, for sure. Think of low-wage work. If you finish your tasks too efficiently, you're not rewarded. You're punished with busy work.
I had a job washing dishes in a restaurant. If I got through the pile too fast, the manager would make me scour the baseboards that were already perfectly clean.
And the lesson is immediate, isn't it? Don't be too efficient, or you'll be degraded with pointless tasks. This kind of make work is training us for future bullshit jobs. It teaches you to operate under supervision, to pretend to work, and to accept that the things you enjoy are rarely what you get paid for.
There's another great example about Mitch, a ranch hand in Wyoming. He was forced to spend hours picking rocks out of fields.
Oh, right, fields that had been plowed 1,000 times. And he knew perfectly well the winter frost would just push more rocks to the surface anyway, but the boss insisted on it. Why? to enforce proper work ethic.
Which, in that context, just means obedience to arbitrary power. It has nothing to do with logic or efficiency.
And the misery that comes from the system is often made worse by this intense anxiety and self-doubt. Graeber calls it scriptlessness.
Yeah, he quotes a worker named Lillian, who talks about this profound fear that one day someone would realize her absence wouldn't change a thing. And that led to her professional confidence just collapsing. Her skills atrophied.
And she wasn't lazy. She was afraid of looking like she was slacking off, even when the system was actively stopping her from being useful. This gets even worse with what he calls moral scriptlessness.
What's that?
It's that agonizing confusion you feel when the outside world treats you with respect. You have a good salary, a nice title, but internally you know you're a fraud. You feel like a parasite, just wasting your one life. There's no emotional script for how to deal with that gap.
And the pointlessness doesn't reduce your stress, it actually makes it worse.
It compounds it. There's Greg, the digital ad designer. He spent his days obsessing over tiny details in banner ads, like changing the position of a steering wheel on a thumbnail-sized image just because a client said so.
And then he found out it didn't matter at all.
Exactly. His own company's data show that no one ever noticed these details, let alone clicked on the ads. And once he knew the whole enterprise was basically a scam, the pointlessness of it all just magnified the stress of the tight deadlines. It led to clinical anxiety.
The stress wasn't proportional to the value of the work.
Yeah.
It was just generated by arbitrary managerial demands.
Which feeds into this finding that the amount of aggression and stress in a workplace is often inversely correlated with how important the work is. Hannibal, a medical researcher who also had to write these throwaway pharma reports,
Okay.
he noticed that the truly meaningful research fostered a calm, collaborative environment. But when it came to creating the completely meaningless bullshit reports, that's when you got panicked, aggressive, top-down stress. It would often devolve into these sadomasochistic power dynamics.
The story of Annie's boss is just chilling on that front. The boss would call her into his office again and again to yell at her for a mistake that had already been fixed months ago.
It was just a ritual of humiliation, a pure, arbitrary exercise of his power, just to rub her face in her subservience and confirm his role as a taskmaster.
And the horror of the bullshit job is that you're trapped in that dynamic. You can't say orange, the safe word that stops the game, because the economic consequences of quitting are just too catastrophic.
That's exactly.
So, okay, that level of personal misery and systemic waste, it just seems insane for an economy that's supposed to be efficient. What systemic force is powerful enough to mandate that much unhappiness? This is where we need to look at the structural mechanisms, what Graeber calls managerial feudalism.
Right. Managerial feudalism is his term for what happened when all those massive productivity gains didn't lead to more leisure time. Instead of making the system hyper-efficient, the wealth that was generated got channeled into creating these entirely new layers of pointless professional managerial jobs and their staff armies.
It's like a kind of sub-infeudation of management.
The perfect way to put it. The goal shifts from maximizing profit for shareholders to maximizing the prestige and power of the manager. A manager's importance starts being measured by how many people they have working under them, how big their department is.
So a vice president needs 2 associate VPs, who each need 3 senior coordinators, who each need 6 admin assistants, all to keep the managerial plate spinning, whether or not the actual output ever improves.
You see a perfect little microcosm of this in creative industries like film and television. In the so-called golden age, a studio might be run by one person with a clear vision. Now, a script has to go through this institutional nightmare called development hell.
It has to get past, what, a half dozen executives with these elaborate overlapping titles?
Yeah.
Executive Creative Vice President for Television Strategy, Senior Director of Content.
And these executives often have MBAs. They're trained in management, not in the craft of storytelling. Their function isn't to help create something. It's to perform the ritual of their own high-powered job by demanding endless revisions and pitching absurd ideas.
Like those shows Apollonia was asked to pitch. Too Fat to Frank or Snipped.
Exactly. It all just results in thousands of hours of effort that leads to absolutely nothing getting made. The managerial class cares more about the form of success than the content of it.
Writing a glossy report that passes an audit is more important than actually solving the problem the report is about.
Playing the role, having the power lunch, performing the ritual of management, that becomes the key to getting ahead, not actual efficiency.
But if we accept that, doesn't it fundamentally contradict basic economics? Why aren't the efficient companies that don't hire flunkies and box tickers just crushing the competition.
And that brings us to the political side of it, the explicit choice to value employment statistics over actual efficiency.
This is where the book brings out what it calls the political smoking gun.
It is. Graeber references a quote from former President Barack Obama during the debates over healthcare reform, and Obama explicitly admitted that keeping the incredibly complex, inefficient private health insurance system was a political priority because of the jobs it sustained.
I remember this. He said, everybody who supports single-payer healthcare says, look at all this money we would be saving from insurance and paperwork. That represents 1 million, 2 million, 3 million jobs.
Billed by people who are working at Blue Cross Blue Shield or Kaiser or other places. What are we doing with them? It's a really remarkable admission.
It confirms that the political system is consciously choosing to subsidize inefficiency, to spend billions on pointless, duplicated paperwork, explicitly to preserve jobs for white-collar paper pushers.
The goal isn't social utility anymore. It's just maximizing employment figures, even if the jobs themselves are totally meaningless.
This sounds a lot like what's sometimes called the iron law of liberalism. Any market reform that's supposed to cut red tape almost always ends up increasing the total number of bureaucrats and regulations.
You try to audit for efficiency, you end up hiring 5 times as many auditors and compliance officers. The solution becomes part of the problem.
And this whole systemic mess culminates in the inverse law of value. This might be the book's most stinging critique, this idea that social benefit and how much you're paid are in an inverse relationship.
And we have to look at the hard data here from organizations like the New Economic Foundation in the UK to really get the scale of this. The findings are just stunning.
So what did they find?
Well, let's take the extremes.
Yeah.
City bankers, who often own millions, were estimated to destroy about 7 pounds of social value for every 1 pound they earned.
Destroy value.
Through destabilizing financial practices, social costs, rent-seeking behavior. Tax accountants were even worse. They destroyed about £11.20 for every pound paid. Their job is often to create market friction and find loopholes.
Okay, so now contrast that with jobs that have undeniable value.
A hospital cleaner, earning a low wage, generates an estimated 10 pounds of social value for every 1 pound they're paid. Through, lower infection rates, just keeping the place running, a recycling worker generates 12 pounds.
The people who make our lives livable are systematically the least rewarded.
So why does this inversion stick around? It rests on this deeply embedded moral justification, this leftover Puritan work ethic, the idea that work is most valuable when it's hard, unpleasant, and maybe even body-destroying, the kind of work the working class does.
And on the flip side, if work is enjoyable or socially beneficial like teaching or caring for kids or nursing, it's seen as being its own reward.
And therefore, it's seen as less deserving of high pay. That's the moral logic that justifies exploiting essential labor. It's how the system encourages what he calls the voluntariat. It expects all this pleasurable, socially useful work like writing open source code or engaging in community care to be done for free or close to it.
Meanwhile, the money is all getting funneled to the goons and the duct tapers who have to fix the problems that creates. The PR firms, the litigators, the compliance officers.
The whole structure is designed to reward the people who manipulate the system over the people who actually sustain it.
And the political result of that is just disastrous. It creates this deep, simmering resentment. Productive workers, the truckers, the nurses, the factory workers are relentlessly squeezed.
And that anger gets redirected. It creates friction between the employed and the unemployed, and crucially, it fosters this hatred towards these so-called liberal elite who are seen as hoarding all the few meaningful, high-paid jobs in media or academia.
And all that vacuous hatred just distracts everyone from the financial class and the political decisions that actually benefit from keeping this bizarre, inefficient system in place.
So in looking back at Graeber's whole framework, it's important to see both its immense strengths and, where it might face some challenges from a more traditional organizational theory perspective.
Right, and the strength of bullshit jobs is just undeniable. It gave a name, a moral vocabulary to this widespread, unspoken problem. Millions of people felt isolated and guilty about feeling their work was meaningless, and this book turned that individual misery into a shared structural problem.
Absolutely. But we do have to acknowledge the tension between Graeber's very moral anthropological critique and the arguments you'd get from, say, traditional economists. The Economist, for instance, in its response to the book, argued that the sheer complexity of the modern global economy requires a massive administrative overhead.
Their point is that we're dealing with these incredibly complex goods, hyper-specialized supply chains that span the globe, intricate financial systems.
And that complexity, they argue, just demands layers of compliance, auditing, and management. It necessitates taskmasters and box tickers just to keep the whole machine from collapsing under its own weight.
So from that perspective, what looks like a bullshit task like filling out Form 37B might actually be a necessary cog in the huge machine required to get a complex product to you, the consumer.
And we're not trying to resolve that tension here. We're just acknowledging that complexity itself does demand some bureaucracy.
But the central argument of the book holds up regardless, that the proliferation of these jobs is primarily structural. It's not the fault of the individual worker, and it's not just a side effect of complexity.
Right. It's the result of specific ideologies like managerialism and audit culture and political decisions that choose to prioritize employment statistics and managerial power over actual efficiency or social value.
So when you look at it as a whole, this book really forces us to challenge some of the core assumptions we just take for granted in our society.
First, it just shatters the idea that economic value, measured by your salary, is the same as social value. The data from the NEF shows that's just demonstrably false. The market is measuring something, but it's not human well-being.
Second, it makes you question that deep-seated Puritan belief that work is some sacred duty and that being idle is inherently immoral. That ideology is so powerful that we think someone paid a lot to do nothing should feel lucky.
But the evidence shows they're often miserable, depressed, and anxious.
And finally, it demands that we recognize the spiritual violence that comes from performing pointless, mandated work that assault on our fundamental need to have a meaningful impact on the world.
And that framework leads us to the biggest open questions that Graeber raises, rather than answers. If the compulsion to work, the need to tie your livelihood to a job, were removed, to be through something like a universal basic income, what would people actually choose to do?
The implication is that most people wouldn't just sit around watching TV. The evidence suggests we have this innate need to contribute that pursues something useful or meaningful or creative.
And the ultimate question the book leaves us with, which comes from that analysis of those sadomasochistic workplace dynamics, is really about human freedom. How do we create a society where an employee can just say orange, that safe word, to an abusive boss or a pointless bureaucracy?
How do we create a world where you can quit a bullshit job without facing catastrophic economic consequences? A world where you can preserve your own dignity?
By understanding the structural pathology of bullshit jobs, we get a little bit closer to understanding what the necessary conditions for that kind of economic and spiritual freedom might actually be. It's a vital conversation for anyone who spends their life trading time for money.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Crisis in Perception. This discussion was based on Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, and we encourage you to read the book yourself or explore it through your local library.
For a shorter visual explanation of this topic, you'll find a mini explainer linked in the description. And if this episode raised questions or ideas, feel free to leave a comment with topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes.
Stay curious and keep questioning what shapes your perception.